Hey Danny, how are you? Your grandchildren, that's so lovely. Nancy, right behind you from Indiana. The Catskills, beautiful area. Up now people are going too fast. Colorado, Texas A&M, Massachusetts, Slaughter Beach, Delaware. That's cool. Hey Nancy, how are you? Yes. 4 weeks of school, not that anybody's counting. It's actually beautiful, really beautiful here today in Maine. It's been very cold, but now it is about 63 degrees and the bugs are out, which those of you from the North Country will know this is not a good thing. So I have my wetsuit with me so I can go kayaking after this instead of walking like I normally would do in the spring. Anyway, let me get right into material now. Somebody just asked in the chat about polls. I will talk in a minute about polls, but I wanted to start today with the big news out of the White House, and that is the imposition of a new set of tariffs on certain things coming from China, things that are less important to our economy, like steel and aluminum. Those are very important to our economy, but in fact, we don't get most of them from China. But also things like electric vehicles. Again, we don't import very many of those. Batteries, and crucially, semiconductors. And so let me just explain tariffs a little bit because somebody wrote and said, isn't this just going to create higher inflation? And a lot of people don't really understand tariffs, and they're very, very important. So let me tell you what they are so you don't have to wince in the future when they come across your desk and you see in the newspapers. Tariffs are essentially, now they're not actually this, but they are essentially taxes that are placed on goods imported into a country. And they're not actually taxes because of the ways in which they operate and the ways in which they're collected and so on and so forth. But think of them like taxes. And why they matter is if, for example, you live in the United States and you are a wine grower and you don't necessarily want to face competition from cheap wine from other countries. So if the government steps in and says, we're going to put a tariff on wine coming in from Australia, for example, or Poland or wherever it's coming in, that will create a protective wall that will make it easier for the wine growers in the United States to develop their product. And with luck, their development of that product will make it cheaper in the long term for local people. At the same time, it will protect those industries from foreign competition in terms of labor as well. So it'll protect the jobs in the United States. That's the macro generic picture of what tariffs are. The idea is that they will protect certain industries in the United States and that will be good for the people here. And other countries do the same thing. We're not the only ones who have tariffs. This is a world thing. But there's a long, long history of tariffs. And I'm not going to, sadly, I'm not going to tell you the history of American tariffs, although it's really, really interesting. It's one of the things that gets us into the Civil War. It's, all kinds of things go on with tariffs. But I will spare you all that. But the reason it matters right now is because for a long time in the United States, in the 1990s, 2000 aughts, there was this sense that the more trade barriers came down, the better it would be for everybody. And in fact, that's not really how it worked out. So there has been sort of this move away from tariffs, I'm sorry, away from free trade in the United States with the imposition of, smaller tariffs in places. And then, believe me, this is such a broad brush overview, but then Donald Trump came in, and he came in without really an understanding of the nuances of tariffs and how, you might not want tariffs in this field, but low tariffs over here and high tariffs somewhere else. And he just put a blanket tariff wall around the country, or at least that was the idea. It was a very 19th century approach with the idea that if you put a tariff wall around the country, it would enable all these industries to start developing here in the United States. And that's actually not what happened. It turned out that what happened was it cost consumers a heck of a lot of money, and it didn't actually create jobs. It actually made America lose jobs. So those tariffs, primarily the tariffs against China, were ones that really he imposed with sort of this populist idea that we don't like those guys, so we're going to have tariffs. But there was also within that some really real issues about where labor was cheaper and where what countries were producing certain goods and so on. So, one of the things that he tried to do before the 2020 election was to do a deal with China whereby China would promise to buy more American stuff if in order to help Trump get reelected. And that's one of the things that got tangled up in the coronavirus because remember, he kept saying China's doing such a great job because he had just inked this deal with them. Anyway, different story. So, so those tariffs, when Biden came into office, those tariffs went into place. The Trump tariffs went into place in 2018. When Biden came into office, they had to do a review of them. You have to review laws like that every 5 years, and so they have just recently finished the review of the Trump tariffs. And what they decided to do and what they announced today is that they are expanding those tariffs in certain fields, not across the board. So Trump has started to say, well, if I get reelected, I'm going to put a 60% tariff on everything. And economists, their hair is on fire going, that's just going to create enormous inflation because you can't put on the tariffs without actually developing the industries. What Biden has done is slightly different, not slightly, it's quite a bit different than that. He and Harris and the administration have poured money into climate change reactions and new technologies, especially those conductors, those semiconductors, and they've put quite high tariffs now on those particular items, especially the semiconductors. And I keep coming back to those semiconductors because that's a really big issue between the United States and China, because China sees the American development of semiconductors as a real threat to their ability to dominate that market. And so China's furious at the idea of these new semiconductor tariffs and at the fact that the United States has poured so much money into the semiconductor industry, which has brought so many jobs to the United States. So the current outlook for those tariffs that Biden is now imposing is that either they're not probably going to matter a lot, like the ones on steel, or they're going to matter a lot, like the ones on the semiconductors. And the trick and the gamble that the administration is making is that having put so much money into those industries so that they're expanding dramatically in the United States, that this should goose that economy. It should make it stronger, not undermine it. So that's actually a really big deal. The idea that we're going to be adjusting our tariff walls in these very surgical ways, which is what other countries do, and that they are designed really to create walls around these industries that are already now booming, as opposed to simply saying we're going to throw up tariff walls and wait for private industry to take care of that, which is what we did in the 19th century and what Trump is really arguing for. It's a very different philosophy behind it, although in both cases, putting walls up between the U.S. and the Chinese economy are very popular for American workers. Now, there's a foreign policy dimension to this as well, and that foreign policy dimension is that China's economy is in real trouble and has been in real trouble now for a while. And it is taking personally its leadership is taking personally any attempt to weaken their economy in this way. They see this as a real shot across the bows for their economy, and they're not happy about it. So there's all kinds of other dimensions here going on. But if you're looking at the economy and you see the word tariff and you think, oh my God, Biden's doing the same thing Trump is doing, why is that? It's the same instrument, but it's a really different philosophy behind it, in that Trump was trying to put high tariffs around everything and say now private industry will pick up the pace here in the United States, and that's not at all what happened, versus what Trump and Harris did, which is to pour money into those sectors of the economy so that they are in fact booming. The numbers coming out of them are really astonishing, and I wrote about that recently when The Economist and Financial Times and all those people are like, oh my God, look at this booming economy. The idea here is that once you've got the economy started, putting up tariffs actually should really help that boom. We'll see, but that's the idea. And it's a really different kind of approach to the economy than we saw in the pure free trade era, which was never really pure free trade era, but when the idea was that the more free trade we had, the better it would be for the United States. Now we're moving into something that looks much more like some of the European countries exercise, and we'll see how that plays out. All right, so that was the first thing that I wanted to mention. Now, another thing that you asked a lot about was um, I don't know why I wrote that down, was the abortion issue and what's happening with abortion around the country, and some of the new laws that are going into place. Not only the attempt to stop their ability to stop the ability of women to obtain abortions, not only for unexpected pregnancies, but also for miscarriages, for ectopic pregnancies, for all the really devastating health consequences of having an untreated pregnancy. And I want to say something a little bit different than I think you're perhaps waiting to hear, and that is these have been going into place since the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health decision of June 2022. And one of the things really to be watching with them is not only what I think we know intuitively, that this is an attack on women's freedom, women's, bodily autonomy. But one of the things that really jumped out to me recently was the attempt on the part of the man in Texas to stop his former partner from crossing state lines. And there is, of course, a layer of abuse there. The idea that having lost control of her in his partnership, that he could enlist the legal system to make her do what he wants. That is, to make her show up and give depositions, to criminalize her behavior in a way that he, once he lost control of her himself, now he could use the legal system to do so. But in a more macro scale, if you think about countries and how they control people or not. I mean, one of the things that's always been a hallmark of the United States is that people could come and go. Citizens could leave and they could come back and nobody pays any attention. I mean, you got to have your passport to prove that you are who you are, but you don't have to register to get permission to go across a state boundary or to go across a national boundary. That is, white Americans don't have to. In our history, certainly other Americans had to. Indigenous Americans did in fact have to get government permission to leave their reservations and to travel to other reservations. And I could tell you really interesting stories about that. But that's sort of a hallmark of freedom, is that you can travel. Now, one of the first things that an oppressive regime will do is it will say other people can't come in. You can't come in here, and you see that with immigration restrictions, for example. Although every country has some sort of a restriction on how immigration works, that's sort of the first way you say you're not one of us, is that you can't come in from outside. But the real kicker is when you can't leave. The idea that you cannot leave your country or your state is a major, major neon red flag of an unfree area. And think about it, you can't leave North Korea. You couldn't leave East Germany. You can't leave, these different countries. And that's really concerning. And concerning in a way that speaks not only to women's rights and to their rights to bodily autonomy and to health care, but it also speaks more widely to the areas in which Republican-dominated states are trying to dictate whether or not people can leave. And that's really a big problem, and really worth having in our lexicon when we think about the issues surrounding the abortion issue in the United States. So I wanted to talk about that. Now, Somebody else, you asked about the abortion issue, and that's what I wanted to add to on this. You also asked about why it's been so hard for Biden to get control of inflation, and I would like to point out that in fact, the Biden administration created the best economy in the world coming out of the pandemic. And it also got inflation under control more quickly than any other country in the world. So those are, especially any Western country, any developed economy. So why was there such inflation after the pandemic? There's pent up spending, there were supply chain issues, there was all sorts of the usual things that one sees usually after a war, actually. But there's also, we are increasingly aware of what we call greedflation, and that is the ability of large corporations to set whatever prices they want and not to have any regulation of that and be able to get away with that because people have pent up savings and because they have so many higher wages. Wages have outpaced inflation for the bottom 80% of Americans. So Pepsi was able to charge more money for its product than it was to be able to do beforehand. And the way you can tell that this has been happening, it's easy to do, is Google the profits of various companies and corporations after the pandemic. Oil companies, for example, have record-breaking profits, and they're passing those profits on to their shareholders, but that's really what's contributing to inflation. So that's one of the reasons that the American administration is having a hard time getting a handle on it, is because they don't have any tools to be able to combat that. What can they say? I mean, they've tried to get price gouging laws through, and that hasn't worked. And they have tried to use the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to do things like cap fees on credit card bills. And that was a law that was supposed to go into effect today, actually. And a right-wing judge appointed by Trump in Texas has put an injunction on that at the request or at the lawsuit of the American Bankers Association and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which says that this is government overreach and they can't cap the things like the overdraft, the consumer, I'm sorry, the credit card overdraft fees. That's not what they're called. The credit card fees, because that's government overreach. So it's been very hard for the administration to use tools to try and rein that in, although certainly they have tried to do so. So that actually, I think, segues into the questions you asked about Clarence Thomas and what the heck. He is in the most secure position in America. He's got a job that can't be taken away from him unless he is impeached, and in that case, the Senate would not have the votes probably to throw him out of office. And has accepted extraordinary financial gifts from a right-wing billionaire, and yet he's complaining about the conditions under which he lives in Washington, D.C., saying it's a nasty place. And, how can he get away with that? And what on earth is he thinking? And I think one of the things that we are facing right now in the United States is that now for 40 years, there has been a certain mindset, certainly in places of economic and political power, the idea that, there are a certain group of people who can behave however they wish. And anybody calling them out for that is somehow challenging them in unfair ways. And, a comparison, I think, is those studies you've probably seen of how a lot of men are not accustomed to give women space in a boardroom setting, for example, and they will say that women are speaking up too much and they're dominating the conversation, when in fact the studies that are monitoring those conversations say that women still talk less than half time. And the idea that having somebody get equal time is unfair because they're taking away the extraordinary rights that other side had. And I think that that's what you're seeing when you see, for example, the people in Trump's orbit who insist it's unfair that they have to go to jail, for example. Peter Navarro complaining bitterly about his time in jail, or the people who were convicted of crimes associated with the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, complaining about the prisons in which they live, or Donald Trump complaining about the conditions in the courtroom where he is in a criminal trial. The rest of us have to do that. That's part of our situation. That's not to say that we shouldn't improve those things, but it would never occur to me to complain that I was being unfairly treated if I were in a criminal trial by the temperature in the courtroom, simply because that's the way the rest of us have to live. So I think what you're seeing with Clarence Thomas is maybe a play of that belief that being forced to answer to the same rules that the rest of us have to answer to is somehow unfair, because it's a group of people who have been treated better than everybody else now for a while. And there are times when we see that in our history, and we've seen it before. It's never not shocking to those of us who don't live that way. But I think that's what you asked about. That I think that's what you're hearing about there. So you've asked as well about what to do about Clarence Thomas in the Supreme Court. And I have said Clarence Thomas is 74 or 75, I don't remember which, and it's high time for him to retire. This idea that you die in place as a Supreme Court justice is a very new one in the United States. People used to come and go off the Supreme Court with regularity. Now, of course, they're trying to hang on for a president of their persuasion. And I think you can lay money on the fact that if Trump is reelected, that both Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito will step down so Trump can replace them, which would put 5 Trump appointees, that is a majority of Trump appointees, not just conservatives, but Trump appointees on the Supreme Court. And that absolutely should be in people's minds as they go forward in the 2024 election. Because, if you think about it, in 2016, Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton said this repeatedly, and everybody said she was a fearmonger. And where we have gotten with that is a series of really extremist right-wing decisions that overturned the established law, which of course all of them promised they would not do, because as I've said before, you try not to overturn established law if you possibly can help it, because it's really destabilizing both for populations and for the economy. And they just threw stuff out the window right and left, Dobbs for sure, but also other things as well. And I think you should expect that if Trump is reelected, that Dobbs will be the least of what we see. They have made it very clear that they want to dismantle the federal government and throw the power of the of government to the individual states, where in many of those states, radical extremists have managed to impose their will on the people in those states. And when they do that, that makes them, that those radical extremists will, of course, impose the religious Christianity that they believe in on everybody. Things like the anti-LGBTQ plus laws, things like getting rid of the right to contraception, getting rid of abortion. Of course, that's already been done. There'll be a whole slew of things, but it's also worth remembering that the whole reason we got the direct election of senators was because the same sorts of things were happening in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the rich industrialists were simply buying up state legislatures and getting rid of government regulation. And in a time of climate change, what that would do is that it would get rid of all the the labor laws, for example, that you're already seeing getting slashed in places like Arkansas, but also would get rid of the emissions rules and the sorts of things that the federal government under the Biden administration has worked to do to try and stop the extremes of climate change that we're already dealing with, and that will only get worse unless we try to combat them. And you've already seen that, of course, with Trump saying he would get rid of the things that Biden had done. But I think that will only get worse if Trump is reelected and gets to put more people on the Supreme Court. All right. So a couple other questions that you asked about. People, I think somebody asked here about whether or not the Hatch Act applied to states. It does not, or to Congress. It does not. It applies to the executive branch. And what the Hatch Act is a law that says that with very few exceptions, and two of those exceptions are the vice president and the president, people who are in the executive branch cannot use their official time to promote the reelection of the president and the vice president. Now, the Trump administration just ran roughshod over that and just basically ignored it. The Biden administration has tried very, very hard to stay within the confines of the Hatch Act, and I can speak to that personally. I was actually in a place with a lot of staffers for the White House. And there were also people there who were campaign people. And they quite literally, somebody said, I can't talk to you because of the Hatch Act. And somebody who was not from the White House said, do you take that seriously? And they said, yes, we certainly do. We could get fired for it, which I thought was really impressive. They didn't know I was listening. I was a ways off. So the Hatch Act is designed to create a very obvious and important wall between the administration and the people trying to reelect him for the president, for the very clear reason that you don't want your tax dollars being used to cement a dictator in power, which is of course exactly what Trump was trying to do. So the Congress is not covered by the Hatch Act, and the reason that you ask that, because the Congress is theoretically, people in Congress are not going to give up their power to a dictator. That was the idea initially in the Constitution. That's not actually how it's played out, but that was the idea. So the reason that people asked about that was because the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, a Republican of Louisiana, was actually at Trump's trial today, calling, not basically what they've started to do is, because Trump is gagged by the judge, Juan Merchan, who's in charge of that case. He's not allowed to say things about the witnesses or the jury. And so, and he's supposed to be keeping his mouth shut about the family members and people who are involved in that case, because it's intimidation if he's out there, saying they're lying or whatever. So what he has done is he's gotten surrogates to go out and show up at the case, and then go out and basically do what Trump cannot, basically call people liars, which is exactly what Mike Johnson did this morning at Trump's trial. And I can't emphasize enough how important this is, that the Speaker of the House, who is supposed to be the leader of the legislative branch, and who is two people from the presidency. So the order of succession goes, the president, the vice president, and then the Speaker of the House. Actually was out there today working as if he was working for a mob boss. And that is simply, first of all, that is simply mind-boggling. But what is even worse than that, I think, and you know what, this is not controversial, is that the Republicans, including the Speaker of the House, have signed on to Trump's project of delegitimizing the rule of law. Because our government depends on laws. Our government depends on the rule of law. Remember, this is a government not of men, but of laws. That whole saying, right? That the law is what matters, and we are all equal before the law, theoretically. Of course, that's never really been true, but it's something to which we aspire. And we have a right to a say in those laws. We have a right to a say in our government. Those are both established by the Declaration of Independence. And the Republicans now are going out in front of the cameras and saying that this is corrupt, that the legal system is corrupt, that this is a political trial, and saying that it should be dismissed. Now compare that to the fact that I think you can make a pretty good argument, and I have done so in letters, that the prosecution of Joe Biden's son Hunter is in fact political. But the Biden administration has said just the opposite. They're not going to get involved, that the rule of law matters, and that they're going to adhere to the rule of law. Similarly, Bob Menendez, the senator from New Jersey, is going to trial for his apparent work on, or his alleged work on behalf of a foreign country. Similarly, the representative from Texas, same thing. He appears to have been working for the government of Azerbaijan, and to some degree for a I think it's a Mexican bank. I can't actually remember. He is also going to trial, and no Democrat is saying, "Oh, this is political prosecution." They're saying, "No, we believe in the rule of law." We have the Speaker of the House, who is standing out in front of the sticks, as it's called. You go to the sticks, by the way. That's what the sticks are, the microphones. That's, we talk about going to the sticks. That's what they're doing. That's the sticks, is the microphones. He's going out to the sticks, to the reporters, to the American people, and tearing down the rule of law. This is head exploding, inappropriate behavior. But there's more than that. The other thing that is really shocking about that is the House of Representatives, of course, has been trying to, the Republicans in the House of Representatives, not the Democrats, who are doing a great job, by the way. The I'm sorry, doing a great job. I said that very offhand. They're doing a great job by keeping the government funded, making sure that the very popular National Security Act got passed, trying to pass a popular bipartisan immigration law. I mean, they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're trying to legislate. The radicals in the Republican Party are trying to do the opposite in the House of Representatives. They're trying to stop the government from being funded. They tried to kill the National Security Act, the Supplemental National Security Act, and the cost for that has been really clear already. People in the Indo-Pacific who've taken a look at, and said so, taken a look at how the United States treated Ukraine and Israel, and saying, we think China's looking pretty good. And quite literally within the last 24 hours or so, the government of Niger has said, we're not going to work with the United States any longer. And they kicked out the 1,000 anti-terrorism people that the United States had in Niger, and said, we're going to turn instead to Russia, because, and quite literally, they said, we've seen how you treat your allies, and Russia doesn't do that. So the House of Representatives has really tried to take on a role itself in saying, we're not going to go along with what you all want. We're going to do this ourselves. Now, in foreign affairs, that's a really big deal, because the Constitution gives the power of foreign affairs to the executive branch. And in terms of negotiating Senate treaties and stuff, it is supposed to get the advice and consent of the Senate. But there's an awful lot of wiggle room in that when they're not dealing with treaties. And over the weekend, on, I don't remember which day it was, but between Friday and Monday, the House of Representatives has brought up a bill to stop the Biden administration from halting delivery of bombs to offensive weaponry to the government of Israel, because the government of Israel under Benjamin Netanyahu wants to go into Rafah, where more than 1 million Palestinians are sheltering. And the Biden administration has said, no, you've given us no reason to believe that this is going to be productive, because you still don't have a vision for what you're planning to do after this war is over. In part because Netanyahu doesn't want the war to be over. And so the Biden administration said, we're going to keep the Iron Dome supplied for sure, but we're going to stop producing offensive weapons. And the House of Representatives under the Republicans in the House of Representatives, have said, no, we're going to force Biden to go ahead and do this. Now, that's about more than Israel and Gaza, although it's certainly about that. It's also about the fact that the Constitution does not give the House of Representatives a role to play in foreign affairs. I mean, it's really just mind-boggling. And where does this come down to? This actually comes down to, I think, a much bigger picture issue. And that is the fact that the extremists in the Republican Party, represented as they are by Donald Trump and by House Speaker Mike Johnson and by the extremists in the Senate, like Tommy Tuberville, who was also at Trump's trial this morning, and the many people, the MAGA Republicans, want minority rule. They want to be in control no matter what the rest of us want. And you can point, I keep pointing to the fact that more than 80% of Americans want common sense gun safety legislation, and they don't. And the fact that the vast majority of Americans want Roe versus Wade to be codified into federal law, and this small minority doesn't. They're managing to get their way through suppressing the vote and through extreme gerrymanders. That, for example, in Wisconsin, after the partisan gerrymanders went into place in 2012, after the 2010 census. In the 2012 election, Democrats got 54% of the statewide vote. You know how much of the legislature they got? 36%. They got 54% of the vote. They got 36% of the seats in the state legislature because of the extreme partisan gerrymandering. This is why it was so important when Wisconsin voters elected Janet Protasewicz to go onto their state Supreme Court. And the Republicans promptly tried to impeach her because she will be a vote to return the state to fair maps, not to give Democrats an advantage, but just to make sure that the voters are represented in their actual delegations, not only to the state legislature, but also from that to the federal House of Representatives. So what we're really seeing here, I think, is an attempt to leverage a small minority to control our government. And that's really terrifying when they're doing things like saying that women shouldn't be able to leave the state to obtain an abortion in a state where that's legal. That's really a big deal. And one of the things that I would like to talk about, somebody said to me, somebody asked what I think I would like people to know. And that's actually a really complicated question, but I'm going to start with, I would like people to realize that what the radical right is doing is it is trying to impose minority rule on the United States of America. And in order to do that, in order to get both the lack of regulations that certain big business people want, and to get the extremist religious rules that the Republican base wants, they are willing to install Donald Trump or somebody like him as a dictator. And one of the things that I want people really to understand is, first of all, so many times in our history, in our recent history, we have seen things happen. And people say, oh, well, it's just one thing. It's not that big a deal. Oh, well, it's not really going to matter. Oh, well, this is just something that's odd. It's not going to really affect things going forward. And let's just start with the 2000 election and the fact that Al Gore conceded that election because he was concerned about protecting the norms of our democracy. And yet, if you look at the fact that before that election, the Republicans in the state of Florida kicked about 100,000 Democrats off the rolls, and then we had that butterfly ballot that now the study has just come out to say, yes, in fact, that did steal the election away from Gore. And then we had the Brooks Brothers riot that stopped the counting in Miami-Dade. And then we had the Supreme Court stepping in and saying, oh, we're only going to do this for this particular election. That's something we should have stood up and said, hang on just a second here. And throughout our history, the reason I'm thinking about that today is because of this attempt on the part of the Republican House to change what the Biden administration can do with regard to Israel. And the reason that I say that is because I looked back at the March 2015 episode when the 47 senators said to the leaders of Iran, don't try and make a deal with Obama because we won't honor it. And I remember at the time that being just a really huge deal. And a lot of people at the time saying, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. They don't really mean it. This may or may not be a violation of the law. We don't really care. And now, of course, we're to the point where this small band of extremists in the House is literally trying to change the way a war is playing out in real time. And that's not, this isn't an agreement. This isn't something that the Obama administration managed to do anyway. This is a really big deal. So I would urge people not to look at what's happening and say, oh, surely they wouldn't fill in the blank. They will fill in that blank, because I think that radical right recognizes that it's not popular. Why do I say it recognizes that it's not popular? Because they would not be doing the things that they are doing. That is trying, the RNC says it's going to mobilize 100,000 workers to go to polls and to challenge voters. You don't do that if you think you're winning. You want people to go out and vote. And that's, of course, what the Democrats are doing. They're encouraging people to vote. They're not saying you have to go vote for Democrats. They're saying, go ahead, go out and vote. We want people to vote because we know if people vote, they're going to vote for what we know people actually want. The Republicans, in contrast, are trying to keep people from the vote. They're trying to stop the counting of votes, for example. One of the things that Laura Trump talked about this week, she is the co-director of the RNC now. Again, have you ever heard of a president's relative being in charge of one of the major political parties? The answer is no. They said they're going to try and make sure that you can't count votes after an election. But you need to know that there are a number of Republican-dominated states who have also said that you can't start to count mail-in votes until after the in-person election is over. And this was put in place largely in 2020 because Trump knew that mail-in votes would benefit Democrats, and he wanted to make sure that you couldn't, he wanted there to be that initial wave that made it look like it was like he was going to win, and then he was going to stop the counting because he knew, as we all did, anybody working in polls, that the Democratic votes would come in after the fact. Now, who's one of the big populations that votes by mail? The military. So what they're essentially saying is that the military shouldn't be able to vote. So again, look what people do, not what they say about this upcoming election. And what the Democrats are doing is saying, please, people, come vote. We want to hear from you. The Republicans are saying, we're going to try and make sure as few people vote as possible, and we're going to make sure those are our people, which says they don't want majority rule. They don't want democracy. They want to maintain their own power. All right, so that's a good transition into polls. The polls are abysmal, and everyone always freaks out about polls. Do not pay attention to the polls so long as they are related to the upcoming election. What you can trust is polls that look into people's feelings about Roe versus Wade, for example, which is 4 points more popular today than it was in 1973 when it was actually decided. That is, reproductive rights are enormously popular, and they are popular among Republicans as well as among Democrats, because Republicans have crisis pregnancies as well as Democrats. And that's going to be a rock on which the Republicans are going to break. And they're really worried about that in the 2024 election, because there's not a person alive who hasn't, or if there is, they're very lucky. There certainly isn't a woman alive who hasn't at one point or another been concerned about either an unplanned pregnancy or a disaster pregnancy, and or an ectopic pregnancy, recognizing that they need care. And that's a really big deal. And people recognize that that's something that has to be possible. You've got to be able to have health care. So you can look at those sorts of polls. You can look at polls on the popularity of school vouchers, for example, which are not popular, even though a number of Republican-dominated states are trying to put them through, because what they will essentially do is put taxpayer money into the pockets of private groups, including religious groups. So that's why those are so popular. You can look at issues, but political scientists will tell you the minute that a politician has taken a position on those things, all of a sudden then the polls are very, very difficult to make sense out of. The other thing that polls are problematic for is that we know that polls have been corrupted because they're designed to push a narrative. And we know, for example, that this is something that the Trump administration or the Trump campaign did in 2016. I mean, it's something that Michael Cohen has testified in this trial, that this is something that they were up to, is to try and convince people of something that is not true. By the way, I always tell you that there's five different ways that the Russian theorists worked to steal democracy away, to get people to overturn a democracy. And one of them is to run candidates with the same name as the name of the candidate that you're opposing. This today in, oh, I don't remember where, it was a Western state. There's a guy, a Democrat on the ballot for an important election whose name is Robert Ferguson, and two other people were running named Bob Ferguson, and they both just dropped out today because they were tagged as this being an illegal operation. And they didn't want to be involved with it. I don't know as much about that as I should, but that's just an aside to say, I'm telling you, this stuff is happening over here as well. That is the corruption of the elections by doing things like running names, not necessarily that those were Russians behind those two names, but this is being done. Um, anyway, so we know that one of the things that you can do is you can build a narrative by saying, oh, look, I've got a new poll, that says X, and people start to go, wow, that's really scary. Once again, watch Tom Bonnier, Bonier, because he breaks these things down and he says, that just isn't going to work. He and Roger Solenberger were the only two people who kept saying this, the red wave of 2022 was not real. And they, of course, were right. It was the opposite. It was all but a blue wave in 2022. So don't pay quite as much attention to the polls as you are accustomed to doing, both because they don't make a lot of sense, because they're being corrupted, and also because it's really too early. If you're here listening to me, you care a lot about politics. Lots of people are not paying any attention to an election that's going to happen a few months out. They're going to start paying attention in August when things really start to heat up and when the conventions start to heat up. And then things are going to change, and they're going to change in a hurry. And again, one of the things I would really urge you to do is watch what people do, not what they say. So the Republicans keep saying that Trump is winning, and yet they're frantic. They're madly trying to keep people away from the polls, and they're trying to spin this and they're trying to spin that. The Democrats are just quietly staffing their campaign offices, putting money out there. Biden, one of the things that really astonishes me is that after all that crap about Biden being old and unable to campaign and all that, nobody is writing about the fact he's doing campaign stops every single day, often in two different states at a time. And that's exhausting. And yet he's out there, he's also governing, he's doing all this other stuff as well. Trump is not. Trump is not doing rallies unless they are handpicked people where he will feel comfortable. And even those are not terribly successful because he keeps sort of slipping on what he's saying. And he also keeps, um, um, going on too long and losing people. So watch what they're doing, not what they're saying. And those are two very different approaches. Am I trying to say that Biden is going to win this election? No, we don't know. And it is very much worth being very concerned about what, as I said to you before, I think that the Republican plan is to create enough uncertainty through violence in certain states that that they will corrupt the electoral count and get the enough people to refuse to certify. Sorry, to count, not to certify. They will already be certified to count the ballots in the House of in the Congress when they need to count things. That it will get thrown into the House of Representatives. That was the plan in 2020. It appears to be the same plan in 2024. That could work. Honest to God, that could work. But it's way too early to say, oh my God, what's wrong with the people around me that they still support Trump? Because I don't think that's established at all. I think again, watching what people do rather than what they say is always crucially important in politics when you study politics, because what people say is its own thing. What people do says what they are really concerned about. And right now, I'm really, I think the Republicans look like they're really terrified. And remember, of course, that Trump is soaking up all the money from the RNC. So if you're a down ballot Republican, you're in real trouble. Now, one of the things that you asked me about was if Trump doesn't get the nomination in the summer, what's going to happen? Where's it going to go? And honestly, I think that that's the biggest tell for why he might get it. Who would step into that place? And the answer to that is I don't know. Maybe Doug, whatever his name is, Borglum. It's Nikki Haley won't, or if she does, well, maybe she will, I suppose, but she might want to keep her powder dry for 2028. Liz Cheney, if I were Liz Cheney, I'd be keeping my powder dry for 2028. Um, and there's really nobody else that, I mean, the problem for the Republicans is there is no figure who can command the suburban voters, if you will, the ones that they're in real danger of losing, the suburban women especially, especially over issues like abortion. There's nobody who can command them and Trump's base. So you could get somebody like Nikki Haley who would win the Republican voters in the suburbs, but Trump's base is not going to vote for a woman of color. They're just not. And at the same time, you could go with somebody like Michael Flynn, who would get that base, but he's certainly not going to get the suburban women. So there's really nobody who can appeal to both of those groups. And I mean, I think you'd have to go with a dark horse candidate that people don't know very well so that they could at least maybe try and squeak in. But I don't know. This is why I don't do politics prospectively, is because I where that would be. Where you would go with that. For the Democrats, in contrast, they have a really deep bench. There's a lot of places that they can go that that would be good opportunities. And I mean, the problems with the Democrats is that if you did go into that deeper bench, it would create a firestorm within the party itself, both because the Democrats argue about everything, but also because they each have, obviously, the obvious place to go would be to Vice President Kamala Harris, who has a very strong constituency among young Americans, women, people of color. She's got a very heartfelt constituency, and they would want to stick with her, and that would be very hard for some of the other people to break in. So who would replace Trump? I have absolutely no idea. But I'll tell you, as I've said before, if I'm a down ballot Republican wanting to be elected, and the people I always look at are the Republicans in New York who turned against, what's his name? George Santos, and got him out of there. They don't want Trump. I mean, because he's a really hard sell in New York and he's soaking up all the money. So if I were them, I'd be saying to anybody else, hey, let's just put somebody in there who can fog a mirror and who will at least stop turning all of the money that's coming in into his own personal piggy bank to pay his legal expenses. Because then I'd have a shot at getting in there. And that would be pretty useful, although maybe they'll figure by the summer when that happens, it'll be too late. I don't know. I would like to point out one of the things about George Santos, and I'm not going to write about it because he's kind of a has-been now. He did across the board, hugely deny that he had anything to do with that drag queen Katara character. This was a lie. These are the Democrats, on and on and on. And of course, now he has fully embraced it, and he is doing cameo appearances as Katara. And that's, again, one of the things that I think I've said to you before is at this point, I just don't think you can trust anything that a MAGA Republican says until it's checked, because they will look right at you and lie to your face. And then, 2 months later say, ha, 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 I got you. So that's worth knowing there, that if you are interested in him, he does in fact perform as Katara. All right. So here's the other question that I'm going to say in answer to what I'd like people to know. And this is the piece I always want to leave you with. Everybody writes to me all the time. Why is the New York Times doing what it's doing? What is going on? Why are you the only one who talks about what the administration is doing? Well, I again have to emphasize that I am a historian. I am not a journalist. And so I am interested in the larger trends in history. I am not that interested in Katara, right? I learned that from a journalist's report, and it's very important if you're, looking at New York politics, or if you're looking at the history of drag in America. If there's any number of ways in which that's really important for the larger scheme of American politics, it's just not of interest to me. So I look at the big picture stuff, and that means that Biden's rebuilding of this country's infrastructure and its manufacturing base is really important. And I wish that were more important to other people in the news media, and it just isn't. I will say it's also fairly complicated, some of this stuff. If you actually spend today looking at where the tariffs have been placed and why those tariffs matter, it's a lot easier to report in Qatar, to be honest. But but it's long past time for Americans who care about this country to prod the New York Times to do something. You can do it. Go ahead and do that. But one of the things that made the radical right take over this country was the fact it trusted its foot soldiers, its ordinary Americans, to take up oxygen at the local level. And it quite literally trained them to do that. And you can see people like Moms for Liberty now, or whatever they're called, Mothers for Liberty, or whatever it is, doing the same thing now, trying to convince their followers to show up to school board meetings, to show up to town offices, to write letters to the editor, to spread things on social media, to talk to their friends, to get out there and take up oxygen, because that's how you change society. And now, one of the things that we have seen since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine is the very successful operation of the fellows, the NAFO or NAFO, however it's pronounced, who are flooding social. Whenever the Russians show up with their disinformation, these guys show up with a sense of humor. They're not centralized. They're just a band of people on social media who undermine all that disinformation that is constantly being put out over social media by Russians who are trying to combat Ukrainian victory by poisoning people, like poisoning people in America, to say, it's the Ukrainians who are the Nazis, or the Ukrainians are losing, or all these different things that they are putting out. And they're just out there all the time joking, saying this isn't true. Here's a fact that says the opposite. And I think one of the things that we need to do going into this election is to create that in the United States about the disinformation that is being spread by the radical right. Are you going to change the opinion of your neighbor who is convinced that Biden has destroyed manufacturing when the opposite is true? He's brought back hundreds of thousands across the country of jobs in manufacturing? No, you're never going to convince him. But that's not who you're trying to convince. You're trying to change the way that the vast majority of Americans think about this country. Is it going to hell in a handbasket the way that Trump and the Republicans are trying to convince you? Or is it, in fact, starting to rebuild itself and embracing this new innovation? Tons of new startups around the country, tons of small businesses, tons of people reclaiming what they care about, tons of people saying, hey, I care about teachers. I care about this election. I care about healthcare. I care about abortion rights. I care about bodily autonomy. I want to get rid of the loopholes in the gun laws that say that you don't have to have a background check if you buy guns at a gun show, or if you buy it in the internet. I care about making sure that labor can organize, and that people get fair wages, and that children actually don't have to go to work in addition to working. In addition to going to school, that we want our children in school rather than having them working in the fields or working in factories where they're losing their arms in certain Republican-dominated states. I care about those things. And here's the kicker: the vast majority of Americans agree with you. This is the whole point of what I'm trying to talk about today, that the Republicans are trying to force minority rule on us because they recognize that we don't want the world that they are trying to impose on us. So what I would like people to understand, that maybe they don't yet, is that we are the majority. Those of us who care about that, it doesn't mean we're going to agree about where tariffs should be or if tariffs should be. It doesn't mean we're going to agree about exactly what the laws should look like with regard to education. And we're not necessarily going to agree with laws about policing in our communities or not. What we're going to agree on is the idea that we want to do it as a democracy and that we have broad-based understanding of the fact we want a government that responds to what the majority wants. And the majority wants progressive legislation right now. May not always, but it certainly does right now. And that the way that we get that is by ceasing to wait for somebody else to do it. For the New York Times to do it, or for the Wall Street Journal to change its editorial page, or that, we're waiting to get permission from that guy next door to say, to wait till he finally says, yeah, you're right, Trump isn't so good. He's never going to say that. But we can speak up and say, you know what? We really like the fact that labor is expanding and that they're getting rights, or that there's going to be more manufacturing, or that we're going to have caps on the cost of inhalers and the cost of insulin in the United States because of what the Biden administration is doing. So the other thing I want people to understand is that for the next 5 months, I guess it is June, July, August, September, October, November, for the next 5 months, this is our time to step up and say to people, hey, let's be part of rebuilding America. Let's be part of the good side. Let's be part of trying to make this work for everybody, because we're all in this boat together. We're not on a freight train to this apocalyptic hellscape that Trump and that the radical right keeps describing. We believe in democracy. We believe in equality of rights. We believe in bodily autonomy. We believe in the rule of law. We believe in the rule of law internationally. We believe in all these things. We may not get it right all the time, but we don't want to give it up for a dictator. And we're going to stop waiting for the newspapers nationally to do this, for the lawmakers in red states to do this. We're going to do it ourselves, which means talking to people, posting on social media, all of the social media, not just Facebook, but also if you're on it, X and Threads and TikTok, if you're on it, Instagram. We're going to take over the information space and make it welcoming and make it creative, make it innovative, and make this a party, and I don't mean a political party, but a celebration that people want to be part of. That's how people like Reagan made the Reagan Revolution attractive. We can make the progressive revolution attractive, not only to people who already vote this way, but also to Republicans who look at where we are and they say, listen, I may not agree with the Democrats about the rights of immigrants, but I can agree that I don't want to turn it over to a dictator. And this is the moment to make that off-ramp attractive to those people and to say, listen, we'll work the rest of it out once we get rid of Trump. And we're not always going to agree, but we need to get rid of Trump and the Trump movement to reclaim this country before they destroy it. So that's what I want people to know. And I want people to know it's not a game and that they really will do this. But there are far more of us, and we have the power to do this, to get out the vote, to change people's minds, and to make this happen before November 5th. All right. Thank you for being here, and let's do it. I'll see you next week.